Have you ever thought about, like, what it means to think philosophically from a certain point of view? Not just big universal ideas, but like ideas that come from a specific lived experience.
Oh, absolutely. It's like, how does our background, our identity shape the way we approach these really big philosophical questions?
Yeah, and like, does that change the answers? Or even the questions themselves? I mean, that's kind of what we're diving into today.
It is, and it's super relevant to this deep dive we're doing. We're tackling Latinx philosophy, which is this really fascinating area that's gotten a lot of attention recently.
Yeah, you sent over this entry from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, Latinx philosophy. Sounds pretty dense, but honestly, it's so interesting how it challenges like the traditional way we think about philosophy.
It really does. Like the whole idea that philosophy has to be this detached, universal thing. Latinx philosophy is like, hold on, our experiences matter and they can change the whole conversation.
Right. So, mission for today, we got to unpack this whole thing. What is Latinx philosophy? Where did it come from? And this is the big one for me. Why should we care? Like, why should this matter to someone who's just interested in, like, ideas and how the world works?
That's a great question. And the Stanford entry does a really good job of laying all that out. It's not just about abstract theories. It's about how philosophy connects to real world stuff like identity, society, politics, all through the lens of the Latinx experience, especially in the US.
Okay, so let's get specific. What exactly are we talking about when we say Latinx philosophy?
Okay, so at its core, it's philosophical work, any kind of philosophical work, but it's got to be about the experiences of Latinx, right?
Okay, so that could be anything from like ethics, right and wrong, to stuff about society and government, even how we know things.
Exactly. It covers a ton of ground. Ethics, social and political thought, epistemology, which is like how we know stuff, even the philosophy of language. It's pretty broad.
Wow. Okay, so that's a lot. But the common thread is it's all got to relate to Latinxes somehow.
Exactly. And this is a key point. Latinx philosophy is super interdisciplinary. It pulls from all these different areas. Critical race theory, feminist philosophy, especially Latina feminist philosophy, even Latinx and Chicanx studies, and of course, all sorts of philosophical
Oh,
traditions.
yeah, like Latin American philosophy, continental philosophy, analytic
Oh, it's
philosophy.
got it.
Yeah,
Caribbean philosophy, Africana philosophy, it's all connected. It takes insights from all these different areas and applies them to the Latinx experience, which, is super diverse in itself.
so it's taking all these different philosophical tools and using them to examine this specific set of experiences.
Exactly. Now, one thing to keep in mind with this Stanford entry is that it's really focused on the U.S. context.
Right, right. Because even though Latinx is used in other places, it's really like a term that came out of the U.S.
Yeah, exactly. So the field, as it's defined in this entry, really zooms in on the nature, the history, the recent developments of this kind of thinking, but within the U.S.
Okay, so we're talking about the U.S., we're talking about Latinx philosophy. What are some of the big questions that philosophers are wrestling with in this field?
So the entry breaks it down into three main clusters of questions. First, it's all about group identity. Like, what does it mean to identify as Latinx? How does that identity actually work, socially and personally?
Yeah, that's a big one. Because Latinx covers so many different backgrounds, it's not like one homogenous group.
No, not at all. And that's part of what makes it so interesting, right? So you've got philosophers trying to figure out how Latinx navigate all the existing categories of race and ethnicity in the US. It's complicated.
Totally. Because,
Yeah.
like, where do you fit in when the boxes don't quite apply to your experience?
Exactly. And this gets into the phenomenology of it all. Like, what does it feel like to have this identity? What's the actual lived experience of being Latinx? And there are so many different ways that people understand their own sense of self as Latinas.
Right, right. So the entry talks about different approaches to this. There's Linda Alcoff, and she talks about an ethno-racial perspective.
Yeah, so Alcoff argues that Latinx identity can function as both a racial and an ethnic category, but it doesn't always fit neatly into either of those boxes, especially as they're understood in the US.
So it's like it can be both, but also neither at the same time.
Right. And then you have J. Angelo Corlett, and he proposes this cultural ethnic group idea.
So that's more about shared culture.
Yeah, like language, family names, traditions. But he acknowledges that ancestry, like where your family came from, also plays a role, especially when it comes to stuff like policies and laws.
Okay, so shared culture, but also where you come from.
Uh-huh. And then there's Jorge Gracia. He's
Huh?
got this familial historical view.
What's that one about?
For Gracia, belonging to an ethnic group comes down to shared historical connections, especially everything that happened after 1492, with Spain and the Americas. It's not so much about ongoing cultural practices, but more about that shared history.
So Elkoff is saying it can feel like race. Corlitt's focusing on shared stuff, and Gracia is all about that shared history. It's like three different ways of looking at the same thing.
Yeah, exactly. And it's important to note that this is just the beginning. Latina feminist philosophers have really pushed this conversation further by exploring how being Latinx, especially being Latina, within a context of multiple forms of marginalization, can lead to these really fluid, even fragmented senses of self that resist easy categorization. Like, it's not just
Right.
about checking boxes.
Right, so much more than that. Okay, so that's the whole question of who are we?
Mm-hmm.
What's the next big area that Latinx philosophers are tackling?
Okay, so the second cluster is all about social and political philosophy. It's looking at these broader societal and political issues, but through a specifically Latinx lens. And one of the biggest things they focus on is citizenship and immigration.
Yeah, those are huge issues, especially now with all the demographic shifts happening in the U.S.
Exactly. The browning of America, as it's sometimes called.
Uh,
It's changing the conversation about what it means to be American and, who belongs.
For sure. And it forces us to confront all these, like, deep-seated issues around whiteness and belonging.
Absolutely. And Latinx philosophy is right at the center of those conversations. It's looking at affirmative action, the complexities of citizenship.
Oh, yeah, like when we talk about citizenship, what does that actually mean? Like, take Puerto Ricans, for example. They're U.S. citizens, but they can't vote for president if they live on the island.
Right. And then you have groups like the Tohono O'odham Nation, whose ancestral lands were split right down the middle by the U.S.-Mexico border. Their whole concept of belonging is challenged by that. It just shows how these abstract ideas about citizenship can have real-world consequences.
Yeah, absolutely. And then, of course, you can't talk about this stuff without talking about immigration.
Definitely. That's a huge focus within Latinx philosophy. They're looking at immigration policies, border politics, the ethical side of people crossing borders.
Right, like, is it ethical to have these really strict border controls? What are the rights of migrants?
Exactly. And you see some philosophers arguing for specific migration rights for certain communities, especially those that have been historically displaced or marginalized.
Wow, so this is like, it's not just philosophy for the sake of philosophy. It's about engaging with some of the most pressing social and political issues of our time.
Exactly. Now, the third area, this might seem a little more abstract, but it's actually really important. It's metaphilosophy.
Metaphilosophy, okay. That sounds kind of heady, like philosophy about philosophy.
Yeah, basically, it's stepping back and looking at the field itself, asking questions like, what are we doing? How are we doing it? Who's included? Who's excluded?
Okay, so in the context of Latinx philosophy, what kinds of questions come up?
Well, a big one is representation. Like, why aren't there more Latinx philosophers in academia? Are there biases within the field that make it harder for them to get in or get recognized?
Right. And then, like, are there certain ways of doing philosophy that might actually exclude certain perspectives?
Yeah, that's a key question. And there's also this whole effort to figure out, like, where does Latinx philosophy fit within the broader history of ideas? What are its connections to other movements, like pragmatism?
Right, like tracing the family tree of these ideas.
Exactly. And then there's the question of the canon, like who gets to be considered a philosopher? Some scholars are making the case that figures from the Chicano civil rights movement, like Cesar Chavez, should be included in the philosophical canon.
Oh, that's interesting, because we often think of philosophers as these, like, old dudes writing in dusty books.
Hmm.
But if you look at someone like Cesar Chavez, his work was all about social justice, about challenging power structures. That's definitely philosophical.
Right. So it really expands our idea of what counts as philosophy, where we can find those philosophical insights. And this ties into that ongoing debate about how we define Latinx philosophy.
Oh, right, because we were talking about the difference between a narrow and a broad definition.
Yeah. So narrow definition, focus on U.S. Latinxes. Broad definition, include Latin Americans. And then there's the distinction between philosophy by Latinxes versus philosophy about Latinx.
So source versus subject, right?
Right. And it seems like the consensus right now is leaning towards a subject-based definition. Like, what matters is that the work engages with the experiences of Latinx in the U.S., whether it's written by a Latinx philosopher or not.
Okay, I get that. So we've covered a lot of ground here. We've talked about what Latinx philosophy is, the questions it asks, the different perspectives within it. But this whole thing is, like, relatively new, right? As a self-identified field, I mean. Where did all this come from?
Yeah, you're right. Latinx philosophy as a distinct field is pretty recent, but its roots go way back. The Stanford entry points to a few key influences. One of the big ones is the Chicano movement.
Oh, yeah, that makes sense. It was such a pivotal moment for, like, Latinx identity and activism.
Exactly. It had a huge impact on how people thought about themselves, their culture, their place in society. And a lot of the ideas that were circulating in the movement were influenced by 20th century Mexican philosophy.
Like that concept of La Raza Cosmica, the cosmic race.
Yeah, that was a big one. Jose Vasconcelos was the philosopher behind that idea, and it was all about this like fusion of different cultures, a new kind of humanity emerging in the Americas.
Right, right. A real celebration of mixing and blending and creating something new.
Exactly. And there were other Mexican philosophers who were influential too, like Samuel Ramos. He was really interested in exploring like what it meant to be Mexican, the national character, all that. And there's even some evidence that the ideas of the Spanish philosopher Ortega y Gasset, specifically his theory of perspectivism, made their way into Chicano thought.
So a lot of different threads coming together.
Right. But the entry makes an interesting point. Even though the Chicano movement was full of like rich cultural and political thought, there wasn't a ton of like systematic philosophical work coming out of it, not in the way we think of academic philosophy today.
Okay, so more like a cultural and political movement with philosophical undertones,
Mm.
but not necessarily a distinct school of philosophy.
Right. Though there was one philosopher who really stands out, Elihu Carranza. His book, Chicanismo, Philosophical Fragments, is a major contribution. But overall, it's complicated to say that Chicano thought is the sole origin of Latinx philosophy, especially because Chicano thought is pretty specific and Latinx philosophy is trying to be more inclusive.
Right? It's about all the different experiences of Latinxes in the U.S., not just one group. So
Yeah.
what about Latin American philosophy in general? Did that play a role?
Definitely. Even back in the late 19th century, you had thinkers all over Latin America who were saying, hey, we need our own philosophy, one that's rooted in our own realities, not just copying Europe.
Oh, so like a homegrown philosophy, one that reflects the unique context of Latin America.
Exactly. And they called it autochthonous philosophy. And this idea continued into the 20th century with some really prominent Mexican philosophers, guys like Jose Gauss, Leopoldo Zia, Emilio Ranga, Octavio Paz. They were all grappling with the specific historical, social, cultural stuff that was happening in Mexico and Latin America more broadly.
So they were building on those earlier ideas of like finding a unique Latin American philosophical voice.
Exactly. And while the direct influence of Latin American philosophy on the early Chicano movement was, kind of limited, later on, Latinx philosophy started engaging with these traditions more directly, especially ideas around the philosophy of liberation and decolonial thought. So there's a growing connection there.
Makes sense. So we've got the Chicano movement, we've got Latin American philosophy.
Yeah.
What about like specific movements within the U.S.? Because the entry talks about Latina feminist philosophy as a crucial origin point for Latinx
Oh,
philosophy.
yeah, that's huge. This is where things get really interesting because, Latina scholars started developing their own philosophical perspectives in a really big way in the late 1980s. And there's one work that's considered foundational, Gloria Anzaldua's Borderlands La Frontera.
Oh yeah, Borderlands, such a powerful book. It's about so much more than just the physical border, right?
Exactly. It's about identity, about culture, about living in those in-between spaces. And even though Anzaldúa wasn't a philosopher in the traditional academic sense, her work was deeply philosophical. It brought together feminist thought, queer theory, Chicana perspectives, all within the context of the U.S.-Mexico border.
It gave voice to experiences that had been, like, silenced or ignored.
Exactly. And her work was hugely influential. It paved the way for other Latina philosophers like Maria Lugones, Ophelia Schutte, Linda Alcoff, remember her from before?
Yeah.
Mariana Ortega. They all started exploring the intersection of gender and Latinidad, what it means to be both Latina and Latinx in the U.S.
So this focus on the lived realities of Latinas in the U.S. is really where we see the most direct link to what we now call Latinx philosophy.
Yeah, for sure. And then as we move into the late 20th century, that's when we see the emergence of Latinx philosophy as a self-identified field.
Like philosophers are starting to say, hey, this is what we do. This is our own thing.
Exactly. Philosophers like Eduardo Mendieta, Linda Alcoff again, Jorge Gracia, J. Angelo Corlett, they were all doing work that specifically addressed the experiences of U.S. Latinx populations. At first, it was often categorized under other areas, like philosophy of race or social and political philosophy.
Right, it was still finding its own space.
Exactly. But then by the late 2000s and into the 2010s, it really solidified. It had its own conferences, publications, journals. It was becoming more and more recognized as its own distinct area within philosophy.
Wow, so it's come a long way in a pretty short time. It's really exciting to see how much it's grown. So where do things go from here? What are some of the big questions that Latinx philosophy is grappling with now, and what are the future directions?
Well, the Stanford entry points to a few key trends. One thing that's happening is the demographics of the field itself are changing. There are more and more US born and Mexican American philosophers doing this work.
Okay, so like the next generation of scholars is coming in, they're bringing their own perspectives.
Yeah. And this might lead to a more specific focus on Mexican American philosophy as its own area within Latinx philosophy. And there's also a lot of discussion, sometimes just like under the surface, about what Latinx scholars should be focusing on. Like should they be engaging with both Latin American philosophy and US Latinx philosophy, or is it okay to specialize?
Right, right. Like what are the intellectual responsibilities of scholars in this field? It's a big question.
It is. And then there's the whole relationship between philosophical work happening in the US versus Latin America. It's great that there's more dialogue and exchange now, but there's also a worry that US-centric ideas might end up dominating the conversation.
Oh, yeah, that's a valid concern. It's like we have to be careful not to repeat those historical patterns of like one perspective overshadowing others.
Absolutely. We need to make sure that Latin American voices are heard and that we're not just imposing a US framework on their experiences.
Right, Latinx isn't just a U.S. thing, it's a global thing.
Exactly. And then the last thing the entry talks about is, methodological differences within the field. There's sometimes a bit of tension between philosophers who are really focused on social justice and activism and those who take a more traditional disinterested approach to philosophy.
Oh, yeah, that makes sense. Like, should philosophy be about changing the world or should it be about like pure intellectual inquiry?
Right. But the author of the entry suggests that these approaches can actually learn from each other. Even if they have different goals, they can enrich each other.
Yeah, I can see that. Like, if you're trying to change the world, it helps to have a strong philosophical foundation. And if you're doing philosophy, it helps to be aware of the real-world implications of your ideas.
Totally. But even with that potential for synergy, there's still this tendency to police the boundaries of what counts as legitimate philosophical work, especially when it comes to marginalized philosophies. So we're probably going to keep seeing debates about what is and isn't real Latinx philosophy.
Right, because these categories are always being challenged and redefined. Okay, so that's a lot to take in. But for our listeners who've been with us this whole time, let's try to sum up some of the key things we've learned about Latinx philosophy. First of all, it's a dynamic field, and it's asking some really fundamental questions about identity, social justice, and even its own definition.
Yeah, it's constantly evolving, pushing boundaries, challenging assumptions.
Right, and it comes from all these different intellectual sources, the Chicano movement, Latin American philosophy, and especially Latina feminist philosophy, which has been so crucial.
Totally. And it's still figuring out its relationship to both the US and Latin America. It's an exciting time to be following this field.
It is. Okay, so last but not least, here's a thought-provoking question for everyone listening. Think about this. How does the existence of a field, like Latinx philosophy, change the way we think about philosophy in general? Like, does it challenge our assumptions about what philosophy is, who gets to do it, and what kinds of questions it can ask?
I think it definitely does. It shows us that philosophy isn't just this abstract, universal thing. It's rooted in lived experiences, in specific histories and cultures. And when we pay attention to those specificities, we can learn so much about the human condition as a whole.
Exactly. Latinx philosophy gives us all these new perspectives on identity, on power, on knowledge, on justice. It makes us rethink what we thought we knew about these big, fundamental questions. And that's something we can all benefit from, whether we identify as Latinx or not.
It's a reminder that philosophy at its best is a deeply human endeavor, and it's always evolving. So keep learning, keep exploring, and keep asking those big questions.
And keep listening to this deep dive. We'll be back next time with another fascinating topic. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.